And we got all the virtual folks and just checking to see who's there. So we wanted to have one other topic to talk about. It would be complementary to the grassland roadmap. And so I was asked if I could talk about the Rangeland Monitoring Group and where we're at with that project. And actually, it's been interesting as a rancher planning member on the grassland roadmap. I've been sort of arguing that the way we do connect the dots from Mexico to Canada is going to be through intentional rural-based communities, ranching communities that are actually collaborating on taking care of their place and doing fairly specific things to document if their place is getting better over time. But the way this thing got started, I've been ranching for over 40 years in the Muscle Shell. My family bought a ranch in '56 over between Great Falls and Helena, and that was sold when I was still a teenager. But I had this sort of conditioning growing up where I found myself pretty comfortable in the environmental community, and also having grown up in the ag community. And it put me in a fairly unique place to talk to people in both groups about how we could be more supportive and complementary of our, what I often felt were mutually supportive purposes in terms of taking care of landscape and making landscapes work, and ranchers to be able to do that and make a living at the same time. So as being involved in a lot of different groups over the years, and being concerned about healthy landscapes, I also was wanting to ask a question, because we personally at our ranch have been doing monitoring for almost 30 years. And a lot of people who know me know why we're doing this. In sort of early years of our career as ranchers, we were introduced to holistic resource management, and were intrigued by this approach of grazing animals a little bit differently over the landscape. But to do that requires some changes in infrastructure and fencing, water development, and not quite, but almost half of our place is on public land. So in order to actually implement that vision we had of doing that kind of grazing, we had to convince BLM to let us do that, and they weren't all that excited, but we did have their field guide for our area. David James was just, you couldn't have been working with a better BLM person to be willing to experiment and be adaptive. But for us to actually have the opportunity to be super adaptive and flexible on our range management, we had to monitor. We had to demonstrate that what we were doing was not going to trash the range. And so to get that program going, we actually had to agree to certain monitoring indicators, and actually had to hire a third-party person who would monitor our place every year. And yeah, we're just about to make a succession to a new person. Roland Cruz has been working with us for almost 30 years doing this. But how this relates to the Rangeland Monitoring Group, when the idea emerged back in 2016, we've been working on this for about 7 years, is for me, having monitored on our ranch and being able to credibly show improvements through our practices, that was really important to us. And it allowed us a lot of opportunities to get resources from different groups because we had actual data, and it made for a good story. And I often thought, well, I've said to people a lot of times that I could have the best ranch in the world, but if all the ranches around me or my rural community was failing, that because of our dependency to our community, the vendors, to neighbors, agencies, if those things were weak, that no matter how effective we were as ranchers, that we would probably fail as well. So I was intrigued about how to get a broader participation of other ranchers in the region to, and having like work like, you know, I was involved in getting the Muscle Water Treatment Coalition involved. I was involved with folks helping get Winnett ACEs going. Was how do ranchers at a community scale, landscape scale, actually be able to tell a credible story to themselves and to the state and even beyond that, that in fact, what they were doing was actually improving the health of their landscape. And so what emerged here, the Rangeland Monitoring Group, is how could a group of ranchers voluntarily working with nonprofits and agencies and academics design a methodology to agree on indicators that we co-designed together that would measure how our practices were changing and evolving the health and resiliency of our landscapes. So it's all driven by how do you do this at a large landscape scale, but not so large that you lose the community aspect of it. And how do we get people to agree on what they would measure that would inform us that if we made positive trends on these indicators, we can make a pretty good case that our work is actually improving the ground. And by improving the ground, so thinking and putting my rancher hat on, it's like, I think all the ranchers that are in the room know that as our cover and diversity and our ability to capture water and to maintain the health of our rangeland is sort of fundamental to our business. And so at the very first level, the motivation of getting ranchers together was, it was like how we could agree to measure data, capture that data, and then be able to share that annually with each other so that we can learn from each other. So the first level was just how to create sort of a learning group of ranchers that could create enough discipline to find something to measure so they could talk about their places in some kind of coordinated, useful way versus just getting together and say, yeah, I do this and you do that, and I think it's cool and it's working for me. No, we got to do something a little bit more specific. So if in fact we are actually capturing more water because of how we're grazing, or we are creating more diversity, or we're supporting more birds or whatever, that we have to be professional enough to have a methodology to capture the change in those indicators. So even after 7 years, I think we're getting closer to actually, it's been a very slow process. I mean, we've been at this 7 years, but it's really started to gain some momentum. But the thing that is becoming more important right now, to me, is not. I mean, I love the feedback and I love the collaboration between ranchers working together with all these other people to co-design. Co-design is a really important word here because ranchers historically feel they're always being told from above what they need to measure, what they need to do to be able to make a case that they're not hurting something. And I've always felt that was, you know, you had people who weren't living and working on the ranch, and it's not like people who don't live and work on the ranch aren't smart about grass or about range, but they just don't fully appreciate the uncertain nature and the changes that we as operators have to deal with day to day. So getting a circle of all those players to actually agree on what those indicators could be and have the confidence that we trusted each other about those. And then to go out and actually capture those or measure those over time. And then to have a platform that you could upload that data and then periodically bring it down, everybody get together and see what they're doing. That by doing that, we could really accelerate our appreciation of cause and effect between how we are raising our land and what kind of returns we're getting from doing that. But parallel to the learning that just ranchers themselves and the people they work with, like agencies and a lot of these nonprofits that are, pretty involved in the CMR group. I mean, right now we're working with World Wildlife Fund. I mean, with actual services or technical advice or even money, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, their bird-friendly program, Native Energy, a carbon company, and then of course NRCS, BLM. The co-benefits that can arise for ranchers if they can create a program like this that they and the people around them and the people who make decisions about what we can do and how people set policy, if we can make the case, very good credible case that we may know we're doing well, but now we're actually using a methodology that we can document we're doing well. And so some of these co-benefits beyond just we as ranchers wanting to improve our resiliency to be successful, which doesn't just involve land management, it involves our production and how we do that and how we manage our finances and are all part of the piece and how we work in our community. In the last few years, it's becoming quite apparent that, and the graph, and this is why it was important to do this sort of in relation to the grassland roadmap, is there's a greater recognition that people realize that ranchers aren't just raising cattle. They're just not in the business of raising beef. They're actually in a very serious business of taking care of millions of acres of rangeland in America. And when they do that well, and when they can tell that story effectively, is there some kind of benefit that could accrue to them to be an additional portfolio sort of income beyond what they do effectively raising livestock? And I've always appreciated, the fact that we were able to do what we do with BLM was reaching out and doing something that probably wasn't particularly comfortable and took a little work. But by doing that monitoring at an individual ranch level, opened up a lot of opportunities for us, whether it's ecosystem services or just the flexibility to do sort of an outcome-based approach on public land. So I was recognizing the benefits of monitoring. I was also recognizing that across the board, generally people weren't really buying into that or comfortable doing that or had the time to do it. And so the other aspect of the Rangeland Group, how could we create a supportive infrastructure that would not make a rancher's commitment to play be difficult? And so the idea is that if you have this group of ranchers, then you work out an economic way to find the right person, the right people to actually do the monitoring. And then you work with other people who might provide resources to help pay for that. And I think we're finding with some of the nonprofit groups that they're providing those kind of dollars. And even more recently, we went in with a group called Western Landowner Alliance in a climate National Fish Wildlife Grant, where hopefully, because we've been operating on very little money doing this, and that's probably the reason we're moving kind of slowly. But one of my visions on this is that if we can really get a neighborhood group of ranchers, and this could be, I think, franchised over a large area, but let's just say central Montana. And right now we have 7 ranchers who are doing this, but we could have, 10, 20, 30 more doing this. And the amount of data that those ranchers could collect and share in terms of our own understanding and sharing with the larger public would be pretty immense. But to actually do that at that scale even the consultants who do the monitoring right now can't even find people who could do that. And so in the last couple of years, we've been really brainstorming the idea. I bet there's a lot of local people, young people, that could do seasonal work and be trained to do that monitoring by the consultants we work with. In fact, we've talked to some people at NRCS about how, because, you know, NRCS does all these programs, but they really don't do any follow-up monitoring, you know. And so there's a lot of incentive for everyone to know that the work that's being invested is returning what people are hoping. So, so that's a piece of this, is that, you know, this could be a form of economic development, not just hiring people to do the monitoring. But then now we're finding that there's just this huge buzz about carbon, about ecosystem services. And I'll be the first to say that we still have a ways to go to figure out what we really mean by stewardship and what we mean by ecosystem services. And should carbon be a driver? I mean, I was visiting with our banker just the other day, and he said, I got all these people coming in talking about carbon, and people approaching them, and you know, we're in a carbon program, and it's an interesting one. And I didn't get into it so much to thinking how there would be a windfall on carbon. I got into it because this particular group was actually providing dollars for infrastructure, fences, and water, because their sort of bias is that by a little higher stock densities, longer recovery periods, and we've learned that tends to create a little bit less bare ground, more diversity, and then theoretically you would model that would mean more carbon sequestration. Whether that actually occurs or not, I think we're still trying to figure out whether grasslands are just a sink to hold carbon and not release more carbon, or whether grasslands could actually add more carbon. So there's quite a debate, you know. I think in time that'll be resolved because there's so much science being thrown at this. But what was great about this company, and the fact that I think we were invited to become part of it, is because we had a lot of data, and we had sort of an openness about experimenting with different things. And what they brought is that they were bringing around $10,000 to $15,000 a year to pay for water and fencing, because they had this bias toward the controlling livestock a little bit more tightly, moving them a little more often, could maybe, you know, create some opportunities for people who are looking for carbon credits. And the whole idea of carbon credits could come into question too. Are we really helping the world if someone's paying me a bunch of dollars to get carbon credits, but in the end we still have increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere? But the point here is that I think there's an opportunity, and this gets back to the community organizing aspect of the Grassland Roadmap, and the idea of like, what's the incentive for ranchers to play here? You know, why should we be involved in this? And I firmly believe that ranchers do play an important stewardship role above and beyond their economic contribution as livestock producers. But to realize and scale that opportunity versus each of us ranchers trying to do these contracts on our own. The idea of a group of ranchers sort of co-opting or forming their own LLC and agreeing to monitor at a level so they would have data to document that they actually are providing a stewardship service, that we actually could make a business out of doing this. But to make it an attractive business and a community-based business, and to actually hire all the people involved in making it work, hire them locally, to me is really an attractive vision. You know, it may be unrealistic and maybe like, you're dreaming here, but I'm not so sure I'm dreaming. And even if all we achieved through the Rangeland Monitoring Group was just improving our range management skills and just improving our grasslands that supports our enterprise of raising livestock, that would be sufficient. I just think there's much more to be gained from ranchers and agreeing amongst themselves voluntarily that, yeah, we're going to measure these things And we're going to arrive at what we're going to measure. We just know if we do measure it at this level, we'll be able to, as a group, maybe contract for services. That would be a lot easier than individuals trying to figure out how to do it. So one of the, so through the Rangeland Monitoring Group, we engage with a pile of different people around the West, trying to get an idea of just how to approach this. Like recently, I was at a symposium at the Society for Range Management talking about this topic. And I was fascinated by this group called Three Creeks. And how many people are familiar with the Deseret Ranch in Utah? So it's a big ranch owned by the Mormon Church and a guy, Greg Simons, and I'm going to get to Greg Simons here pretty quick. And then, Molly's going to have to say, got only so much more time, Bill, because I can talk about this all day. Greg Simons, fascinating guy, didn't really grow up as a rancher, but he was hired 30 years ago by the Mormon Church to run this really large ranch, $150,000 down in Utah, 150,000 acres down in Utah. And he had been introduced to holistic resource management, and he really kind of figured out how to manage that grass and create all kinds of opportunities for making their livestock enterprise work, improve their cover, improve wildlife. And there was this group of ranchers that in part of a BLM grazing district, 38 permittees that were like not quite across the fence, but pretty close. And at the beginning, just that's crap, that's bullshit, we're not going to do that. And but over the years, they kept looking across the fence and saying, something's happening here that seems to be working. And they were wrestling with some issues, some water quality issues because of their grazing. And the president of that grazing association finally said, maybe we should take a look at these practices. And to make a long story short, and this has occurred over the last decade, that it boggles my mind. 38 permittees formed their own LLC to do one permit with BLM. With the goal of having this adaptive grazing, they started grouping their herds. They didn't just have 38 people doing 38 different things. In order to create this impact and this recovery, they were able to hire, a really innovative guy down in Utah working with BLM, and they were able to get some money to hire this consulting company who did monitoring, and a really cool company that's into working lands and supporting livestock businesses. And so they had professional people who could do the monitoring, something like we're trying to do voluntarily with the Rangeland Monitoring Group. And so when they put that in place, and they came up with this, and it's only in the last couple of years that they actually were able to change their business structure, but they gave a presentation, and just in a few years, they're making significant progress. And now they're thinking as 38 ranchers in this fairly rural part of Utah. They're having discussions with people like us and some other like Western landowners. It's like, well, can we start marketing what we're doing? And it's really interesting. Ranchers, even with the program I'm in, they're including public land in part of the sequestration, deal. When I saw that, it's like, yeah, there's 38 ranchers that cooperatively formed an LLC to optimize their situation. And, I can't say how this will turn out, but 38 ranchers in central Montana who don't necessarily operate on the same grazing association could do the same thing and yield comparable results. And the Rangeland Monitoring Group is a means to explore and investigate and test whether that would be possible. And again, so we're just slowly kind of bringing in other ranchers, slowly trying to get enough players to agree on what to measure. And then we work with a group called Soil Carbon Coalition, Peter Donovan, who's kind of a elder in the soils issue, and he's coming up with kind of a template of how we store our data. And we're quite committed amongst ourselves to be very transparent about sharing our data. I'd like to be really transparent, and we have with in our own ranch, transparent, being very, I mean, our data, anyone can go into BLM and see exactly what we're doing. Because it's, yeah, it's just all public record. But, you know, just a couple of days ago, I talked to Greg Simon because he sent me this video of what they had done over 20 years on this 350,000 acre ranch that I think was by a gold mine, but he was responsible for managing it. And at some point, I'd like to share this video, but I mean, it just shows what he made this interesting comparison. Over 20 years, he took this totally damaged riparian area, and he was able to measure through remote sensing, because that's the other thing Greg Simon's done. And that's, I'm going to read a little bit of what he sent me, is that he was obsessed with this idea. How could we document what good stewards are doing and then turn it in and be able to use it in the marketplace? But this 10-minute video of what he had done in 20 years in terms of transforming that riparian area and the amount of moisture that they were saving in their ground. He made a comparison to like Lake Mead. So over 20 years, we've taken this large ranch and totally changed our aquifer. And in the same 20 years in the Colorado, dams are drying up. And, you know, I mean, that may be a little bit of a, you know, broad, maybe not useful and maybe not even scientific comparison, but it was a watershed within, you know, that part of the range in which they, over a fairly dry period, really transformed their water holding capacity and the condition of the riparian area. And so he, you know, Greg in his very obsessive, visionary way, you know, just projects that out like, God, what if we were managing all our riparian areas? And these are on working lands. This is not like fencing things off or taking cattle off the ground. These are on working lands. In fact, he's making the arguments because they're on working lands and because they're using livestock thoughtfully, it's actually the livestock that are creating the pool that's creating this opportunity. So again, you know, trying to show the synergy of what we could do here and working with the Grassland Roadmap, I and the people in the Rangeland Monitoring just have this vision of creating sort of neighborhoods, communities, in which we formally start gathering data together, coming up with a template on how that data is stored, coming up with means and how we talk and communicate with each other about that data, and continue to figure out how we can improve what and how we do things. But I'm going to finish, you know, I was just so taken, you know, I asked Greg, I said, you know, I'd love to have you come up here, because, you know, Greg's company is actually, and Paul knows this, I think, I mean, he's mapped 12 million acres in Montana with the program. He's got the best remote sensing program, you know, in the country. And we all know about the rangeland analysis program, but his is a lot more precise. Have you seen his data? Paid for it. You paid for it. I'm arguing about this freaking years now. These guys, BLM and U.S. Fish and Wildlife have paid for all this remote sensing work that basically tells us what our land looked like 30 years ago and what it looks like now. Pretty, I mean, and I've been paying someone like $2,000 a year to do these individual samples, which is fine, but it doesn't even, you know, I mean, then someone could just look at satellites and say, well, Bill, you really didn't know you have to spend $50,000 over the last 25 years. Got Greg to go do your thing, but Greg was obsessed with finding a means to document at scale what is happening on the ground on working land. So I asked him after I saw this video, I said, oh, this is an awesome video, man. We should get you up here and do a program here or whatever, you know, and tell your story. And I said, can you just write down in, you know, one page, you get it a little more than one page, what you actually want to do. And I'm not going to, because it's just a page and a half. So, but to give you a flavor of, so I won't read the whole thing, but I'm going to read it because to me, he is putting it out there to us like, this is what I think is possible. And this is how I think we might go about it. And again, this guy is like a capitalist, you know, I mean, I want to figure out how to make money out of doing good conservation. So I'm going to go about halfway into his letter here. And after I finish it, I'll just stop with that. Because I mean, there's a lot of new things that are happening right at this moment that's changing the projection of the Rangeland Monitoring Group. But grade captures as closely as I could envision what I've been trying to think about in my own head and how we could really help ranchers by working more collaboratively about, you know, how we take care of ground. So here it goes. 30 years ago, I started thinking about what new significant sources of income could be. I came to believe water was the most valuable resource that ranchers have direct agency to affect. Water and its management have been the basis of my ranching success. By grazing in a manner that increased plant production, it decreased our bare ground, that in turn increased the infiltration of our rainfall and snowfall. This increased our stocking rate, reduced our need for hay, increased our fertility, and improved our riparian areas. Healthy riparian habitat is easy for most publics to appreciate, and these changes and how we got there. And so then he brings up the YouTube that I was referencing. He goes on, giving speeches and showing slides might show a change, but it's not quantifiable and thus can't support a trade in the free market. Markets require measurement so that willing buyers and sellers can determine a value that both can agree to. How does a buyer of water security know that a rancher is providing that value? That's why I've been working for over the last 2 decades to make a scale that measures the environment in an accurate, precise, timely, and cost-effective way. The historical means of measuring environmental conditions by taking some ground samples, he's referring to what we do, that represent a tiny, tiny amount of an area on a day is not representative of how a landscape is functioning. At best, if they are collected by knowledgeable people in an unbiased way, they tend to not only represent the climate conditions on that day, on that spot. The numerical output of these historical range monitoring techniques doesn't seem to inspire ranchers or agency folks. I always wondered why more people didn't want to do this. These traditional range monitoring techniques are not done consistently or in a consistent manner and fade in and out of interest. Contrast that with weighing cattle on the day they are sold. The buyer and seller are glued to the results of each draft of weights from a trusted scale. I've been working on developing a trusted scale for environmental values that can engage ranchers and the environmental values market. We've done this by coupling ground sampling with remote sensing so that we can measure ground cover conditions of every square yard over entire landscapes and back and forth through time. Our methods have been in peer-reviewed journals and patented, but what we're most proud of is that on-the-ground managers have validated our cover maps and said they look accurate. Ranchers have been our primary interest, not publications for scientists and not large-scale vegetation maps that are not accurate at a pasture scale. We've applied our technology to over 60 million acres. We answer questions like vegetation production, where the most economical place to have livestock water, what should be the stocking rate, quality and mountain location of endangered species habitat, where the weeds are now, where they're going, amount of soil carbon. Recently, we mapped 12 million acres of sage grouse priority habitat in Montana. U.S. Fish and Wildlife used our work to publish a peer-reviewed paper that showed that our maps of ground cover conditions were correlated to presence of sage grouse flights. These maps could inform ranchers in this area what their conditions are, how they changed over the last 30 years, and provide insights to their management. In addition, they could be used to create new markets with those interested in environmental values. So this mapping has been done on our property already. Peter Drucker, a well-known management consultant, said, "How well you measure will determine how well you can manage and market. Developing significant changes in environmental management will require significant economic incentives for ranchers." That's the crux. The trusted markets require a trusted scale to measure water security, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. All these values are something that ranchers have comparative advantage, if not a monopoly, in doing in an environmentally friendly manner. These values can be layered, and the tool to create them is proper grazing, which is based on a renewable resource that happens to be edible. The appreciation of environmental values, and I'm not saying bison can't do this, so the appreciation of environmental values has an entirely new audience than the traditional groups of NGOs, agencies, and scientists. I had numerous contacts with bankers looking for real outcomes that are fundable to mitigate climate change. I'd like to explore how your working groups could be paired with our unique means to measure landscape conditions. It seems possible that together we might be able to create another significant step in moving ranching into new markets that are synergistic with historical experiences of ranch. So, there were 3 chapters before it. So, yeah, so I apologize. It's not that much fun to be read to, but basically, Greg, you know, I incentivized Greg to say, yeah, write a one-pager that's a little longer than a one-page that could intrigue us, you know, as ranchers. And I think working with, I mean, to me, I've also felt the range, and I've talked to Paul, and we've talked with APR, and I'd like to talk to tribes. I mean, we're all working and living in the same grassland, you know, so it's not like the indicator should be different in this place or that place. And I'd love all those groups to benefit from better monitoring. But the idea here, and you know, could be a future CMR meeting, is there is an opportunity for we ranchers to generate some more money. I think, and as just for stewardship, I could be wrong, but I think it just looks like it's heading that direction. But to do it right and to do it at scale and to do it vetted so everybody trusts the process. The idea of having multiple ranchers in the room asking the hard questions, I think would come up with the best way to proceed versus just me or someone else figuring out how to do it. I think it would be more powerful. It would tell a better story. And, you know, and related to that, and we sort of maybe, you know, some of you are aware of the Life and Land Project, in which we're using videography to tell stories about collaborative communities doing just this kind of work. So I think we're in a pretty important time, and the fact that this could relate to a large project like the Grassland Movement, that this might be the incentive to get ranchers to do what they often don't like to do, is have to go to meetings and work with them because they're busy, and I get it. But if we could create the capacity through like organizations like ACES or RSA, or even our own stock working group, is that if we can build some capacity, it's just like having Molly here to help coordinate this. Having capacity to have staff people help people like ranchers to create these kind of outcomes is the key here. And actually, we just became part of a small part of a very large grant that's asking these very questions of how to answer these questions. So we're just right. I mean, we're in the water swimming, and I've just, you know, Ken and Live talks about this. I think we're ready to take this thing to a new level, but I don't know exactly how that'll happen. But we have a great circle of people. We live in probably one of the most looked upon areas by people we may like or not like in the world, and that's just, whether you like it or not, that's just the case. That's just the reality. This is one of the last large unfragmented grasslands with a pile of species that were here when Lewis and Clark went through, and left in the world. And so yeah, the interest is there, and the key is how can we collaborate, as whether we're wildlife refuges, whether we're ranchers, agencies, and nonprofits, APRs. Is like, is there a way to do something that creates mutual benefit for everybody? And I don't know if there is, but I think we're closer than we have been in terms of our capacity, and the right people in the country and the right agency folks, that people are really coming into alignment. We want to save these grasslands. We want to create this stewardship. Ranchers need to create a positive relationship with the public. And we can do all those through this kind of approach. But by the key word here, I'll say it more times than people would like to hear it, is co-design. The ranchers need to be an equal player at the table to figure out how to do this.
We do one added part to your equation that you really touch upon is that there are a number of corporations out there looking to offset their carbon impacts. So you have that weighting and asking the same questions, how do we do that? So I think there's opportunity there for those efforts to meet out.
Yeah. So anyway,
Question for you. Who leads the Rangeland Monitoring Group? Do you have, is there a coordinator? Is that you?
unfortunately, I'm probably trying to help, but I'm the worst administrator in the world.
Because I went to a Winnett Aces meeting and they were talking about like what makes Winnett Aces. And the people that put that time into it and want to see positive things happen.
Yeah, that's it's basically it's there's no, I mean, I probably triggered it, but if anything I've brought to this is I just have a curiosity about what's going on around the West, and so I've made a lot of relationships, and we've had the experience of doing monitoring ourselves and working with NGOs, but I mean, ACES is basically is our fiscal sponsor on grant requests. And so I have over 7 years have been slowly kind of encouraging, this could be a program with ACES. But I've been very careful as with so many things, is with particularly with ranchers, is don't demand anything, make requests, make a case, and if they think it's cool, they'll eventually come on board. But no one's going to force a rancher to do something.
It's the same way in the agencies, trying to get field folks on board.
Can you